You'd be nothing without me. She didn't raise her voice when she said it. That was the part that lingered. We were standing at the far end of the conference table. Walnut, 12 seats, the kind of table that absorbs history. Her hand rested lightly on the back of the chair reserved for the managing partner. Mine was folded in front of me. There were 6 other people in the room. 2 attorneys, our CFO, a junior associate pretending not to listen, and Daniel, who suddenly found the grain of the table very interesting. She offered the line the way someone offers a closing remark at dinner, polite, final, almost generous. You were good once, she continued, smoothing a wrinkle from her sleeve. But if I hadn't stepped in, if I hadn't structured things the way I did, Harold, you know this as well as I do. Harold, not my husband, not even he, just Harold. I felt every pair of eyes shift, not toward me, but away. That's how humiliation works when it's done properly. No spectacle, just quiet agreement. I nodded once. Not because she was right, but because I wanted her to finish. She believed she was holding the reins. The accounts were in her oversight. The board favored her initiative. Even the attorney seated to her right had been communicating through her for months now. She had prepared carefully. What she didn't prepare for were the documents in the slim leather folder, resting beside my hand. I hadn't opened it. Yet I watched her speak about transition, about necessary evolution, about how sometimes love means stepping aside. When your time has passed, there's a particular calm that comes when you realize someone has mistaken your silence for dependence. She concluded with a small sympathetic smile, the kind reserved for difficult children and aging men. And truly, she said, folding her hands, without my intervention, this company and you would be nothing. That was the moment. The moment she believed the ground beneath me was hers. She didn't see the documents, but to understand why they existed, you have to go back 17 years. 17 years earlier, I signed the lease for our first office with a pen I still keep in my desk. It wasn't much of a space. 2 rooms above a bakery that opened at 4 in the morning. Every day smelled faintly of yeast and burnt sugar. I liked that. It reminded me that someone else was already working before the sun came up. I've always preferred beginning before the noise. Back then, the firm was just me, a metal filing cabinet, and a borrowed printer that jammed if you looked at it too long. I handled compliance consulting for mid-sized manufacturing companies. Unremarkable work, steady work. The kind that doesn't make headlines but keeps doors open. When I met Evelyn, the company was barely a year old. She was sharp, organized in ways I wasn't. Where I focused on long-term structure, she saw immediate efficiencies. We married 18 months later. I was 48. She was 41. Neither of us particularly sentimental about it. We were practical people. At least I believed we were. In those early years, she helped streamline billing and introduced software that saved us hours each week. I won't pretend she didn't contribute, she did. And I told her so often. But contribution and creation are not the same thing. The foundation, the contracts, the risk models, the client relationships, those were built long before she walked through the door. I spent years driving to industrial parks in the rain, sitting across from skeptical plant managers who wanted proof I could save them from regulatory penalties. Trust is slow work. By our 5th year of marriage, the firm had grown to 14 employees. By 10, we had 42. We moved into the Walnut Table office. We hired attorneys in-house. We acquired 2 smaller competitors whose owners were ready to retire. Through it all, I kept my habits. Up at 5. Black coffee. Legal pad instead of tablet. I reviewed every contract over $500,000 personally. I signed every birthday card. I never raised my voice in the office. Evelyn preferred visibility. Industry galas, Chamber of Commerce panels, photographs, she was good at it. People remembered her. They remembered me too, but differently. I was the one they called when something went wrong. Somewhere along the way, we divided responsibilities more formally. She took on the title of Chief Operating Officer. It made sense. She had an aptitude for internal systems. I remained managing partner and majority shareholder. The word majority is important, though it didn't always look that way on paper. 5 years into the marriage, at her suggestion, and on the advice of a tax attorney, I transferred a portion of my shares into a spousal trust. It offered estate planning advantages, asset protection, continuity. It was objectively a smart move. Everything we build is ours, she told me at the time, sliding the documents across the kitchen counter. This just reflects that. I signed without hesitation, not because I was naive, but because I believed in alignment. There's a difference. Over the next decade, I continued structuring our holdings carefully. Multiple entities, layered ownership, quiet safeguards that any cautious founder puts in place, not against a spouse, but against volatility, lawsuits, market downturns, sudden illness. I've never been reckless. If there's a flaw in my character, it isn't carelessness. It's assumption. I assumed shared ambition meant shared humility. I assumed gratitude flowed both directions. At home, our life was orderly, even pleasant. Dinners at 7, weekends at the lake house I purchased in her name for our 10th anniversary. She liked gestures like that. "You trust me completely," she once said, almost admiringly. "I trust what we're building," I corrected. She smiled. But there was something in her expression I couldn't quite place then. A quiet calculation, perhaps. Or maybe I'm rewriting history. Success changes the temperature in a room. It introduces new variables. Advisors, invitations, opportunities whispered at cocktail events. Evelyn began spending more time with attorneys and financial consultants I hadn't personally vetted. "That's my department now," she would say lightly. "You focus on vision. I'll handle the mechanics." It sounded reasonable. And for a long time, it worked. But subtle shifts rarely announced themselves. The first time she referred to the company as what I built, it was at a fundraiser. Small slip, easily dismissed. She corrected herself quickly. Still, I noticed. Then there were meetings scheduled without my presence. Draft proposals I saw after they'd been circulated. Clients congratulating her on initiatives I hadn't approved, each instance minor. Together, a pattern. I did not confront her immediately. I believe in observation before reaction. Patterns reveal intent more reliably than single moments. Looking back, I can pinpoint the season when respect began to erode. It wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with slammed doors or shouted accusations. It arrived dressed as concern, and it began with a simple question over dinner one Tuesday evening. "Harold," she said, setting her fork down gently, "have you thought about slowing down?" That was the first time I realized she no longer saw me as the architect, only as something aging within her design. I answered her calmly. I had no idea it was the beginning of an audit. Not of the company, but of me. "Have you thought about slowing down?" She asked it the way someone might ask about reducing sugar. Casual, almost affectionate. It was a Tuesday. Pot roast. The lake house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. I remember small details when larger ones are forming. "I wasn't aware I'd sped up," I said. She smiled faintly. "You know what I mean. I did." I set my fork down carefully. "If this is about the Henderson account, we resolved that last week." "It's not about Henderson." She folded her hands. "It's about you." There it was, the soft framing. She leaned back in her chair and studied me the way she studied quarterly reports. "You've carried this company for a long time. No one denies that. But industries change. Energy changes. Leadership styles change." She paused. "And sometimes founders don't notice when they're holding things in place." Holding things in place. An interesting choice of words for a man whose job was risk containment. "I still review every major contract," I said evenly. "Our retention rate is 94%. Revenue is up 12% year over year." "That's not the point." "It usually is." Her lips tightened slightly. Not anger. Adjustment. "I've been speaking with some advisors," she continued. "Objective perspectives. They've noticed certain bottlenecks." "Advisors I haven't met?" "They're operational consultants, Harold. They report to me." There was no accusation in her tone, only quiet assertion. I took a sip of water. "And what exactly have they observed?" She hesitated, as though weighing how delicate she needed to be. "They think the company's identity is too tied to you." I almost smiled. "I founded it. Yes, but that's precisely the vulnerability. She leaned forward. If something happened to you, health, burnout, anything, the transition would be destabilizing. I'm not ill. That's not what I'm saying, but it's what you're implying. The air shifted. She exhaled slowly, adopting a tone I'd heard her use with underperforming department heads. This isn't an attack. It's planning. You're 65, Harold. 66, I corrected. Exactly. She gave a small, conciliatory nod. Most men your age are thinking about legacy, succession, preservation. I have been thinking about succession for years. Yes, but informally. Her eyes sharpened. The structure still places too much authority in your hands. There it was. Authority. I let silence stretch between us. Silence has weight when you allow it to settle fully. What are you proposing? I asked at last. A gradual shift. You take a more symbolic role. Chairman Emeritus, perhaps. I assume day-to-day executive control. Publicly, it signals modernization. Internally, it streamlines decision-making. You already oversee operations. This would formalize it. And my voting shares? She didn't answer immediately. That's where restructuring comes in, she said finally. For stability, I studied her face. There was no visible malice, only certainty. And whose idea was this? I asked. It's simply the logical next step. That wasn't my question. She held my gaze. Mine. I nodded once. You believe I'm becoming a liability. I believe you deserve to rest, she replied smoothly. You've done enough. The sentence should have felt generous. Instead, it felt like dismissal wrapped in gratitude. I'm not tired, said. You don't have to be tired to step aside. I built this firm from a folding table and a leased printer above a bakery, and I helped turn it into what it is now, she replied, a flicker of steel entering her voice. You don't get to erase that. I haven't. But you behave as if your role is irreplaceable. Every founder is irreplaceable, I said quietly. That's why companies fail when transitions are rushed. Her chair scraped softly against the hardwood as she shifted. This is exactly what I mean, she said. You hear evolution as insult, and you frame displacement as care. For the first time that evening, she looked irritated. I'm trying to protect what we built, she said. From ego. The word hung between us, ego. I considered responding defensively. Instead, I asked a simpler question. If I decline? Her gaze did not waver. Then we may need to explore protective measures. Protective for whom? For the company. There are moments when tone reveals more than content. Her voice carried an assumption that the company could be separated from me cleanly, surgically, as though I were an outdated component. I'll review whatever proposals you draft, I said at last. With counsel. She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. Of course, she said. We both want what's best. That night after she went upstairs, I remained at the table. I replayed every word. Not for volume, but for pattern. This wasn't about fatigue or modernization. It was about control. Over the next several weeks, small changes accelerated. Meetings were scheduled under her authority. Financial summaries arrived pre-filtered. When I requested full reports, I was told they were being finalized. Language shifted. Suddenly, she began introducing herself at events as the driving force behind our transformation. I became our founder. Past tense. Then one afternoon, Daniel, the CFO I'd hired 12 years earlier, closed my office door behind him. His posture was different. Careful. There's talk, he said quietly, about consolidating signature authority. In whose hands? I asked, though I already knew. He hesitated. Hers. I nodded once. And is that what you believe is best for the company? I asked. Daniel swallowed. I believe the paperwork is moving quickly. Paperwork, so it had begun. That evening, I opened my private file cabinet, the one no one else had access to. Inside were copies of every structural document executed since the company's inception. Trust instruments, holding agreements, contingency provisions drafted years ago. Not out of suspicion, but discipline. I ran my fingers along the edge of a particular folder. Preparation is not paranoia. It is patience made tangible. Upstairs, I could hear Evelyn on the phone. Her voice carried easily through the hallway. Yes, she was saying. He won't resist much longer. He knows he can't run this without me. I stood very still. There it was, not concern. Certainty. And certainty, when misplaced, has a way of unraveling quietly. She presented the documents on a Thursday, arranged neatly on a leather pad across the dining table. No urgency. No visible intimidation. Just the quiet confidence of someone who believes the conclusion has already been reached. I asked our attorney to draft a continuity protocol, Evelyn said, smoothing her napkin over the last page. Standard operating procedure for any growing firm? I glanced at the heading. Uniform powers of attorney, signatory authority delegation, succession continuity agreement, all familiar language, all expedient when framed correctly. Operational continuity, not succession, she added, catching the slight shift in my expression. Just in case of travel, health, or any temporary limitation. I considered the words. Temporary. Any. You want me to sign over executive signatory authority to you? I said. I want us to be protected, she corrected gently, so decisions can continue if you're unavailable. Insurance companies require it. Our banking council suggested it. It's routine. Routine. I had spent 2 decades reading contracts. Routines are rarely insidious until they're renamed. There are certain gestures that reveal more than legal language ever could. The way she placed her pen beside mine. The way she didn't ask me to sign, she simply waited. The subtle expectation that hesitation would look like obstruction. I picked up the document and read carefully, clause by clause. Most of it was standard infrastructure for estate continuity, but the second schedule contained an operational addendum. It granted unilateral signatory control over operating accounts, not emergency access, day-to-day authority, including accounts I had historically directed. Who drafted this? I asked Marcus Thorne. He's been overseeing our corporate filings for 6 months. I hadn't met Marcus Thorne. That should have been enough, but I didn't interrupt. I let her finish explaining why protecting the company from uncertainty required this step. She spoke about prudence, about foresight, about how enlightened leadership distinguishes between ownership and execution. Every sentence was reasonable. That was the design. When she finished, I set the file down. I'll review it with my own counsel before signing. Her smile thinned, but only for a fraction of a second. Harold, no need to complicate a straightforward formality. We can discuss it tonight, I nodded once. I will. After she left the room, I carried the documents to my study. I laid them across the desk beside the master ledger I maintained for internal audits. Not because I distrust assumptions, I distrust patterns, and patterns are confirmed in margins. I opened the bank portal. The interface was familiar. The numbers were not. Across 4 operating entities, signatory thresholds had already been adjusted. 2 accounts now required dual authorization, where previously only mine had sufficed. On the surface, that sounds protective. In practice, dual authorization with an aligned CFO and a sympathetic attorney creates a controlled bottleneck, access through structure. I printed the changes. The timestamps were recent, within 48 hours, possibly less. Someone had moved quickly. I spent the evening at my desk with a legal pad, mapping the sequence of authorizations required for each alteration. Every step was procedural. Every step left a paper trail. That's what you expect from professionals. You also learn to expect that professionals can be guided by a single objective, not conspiracy. Alignment. The distinction matters. By 11 o'clock. I called my former bookkeeper, Anne. She had retired, but I still valued her instinct for irregularities. Evelyn asked me to update the board packet, I began. But before I did, I noticed the signatory structure shifted on Friday. She listened quietly. Did she send you revised templates? Yes, clean, final looking. Did she mention why? Protection, continuity. Harold, Anne said carefully. Sometimes continuity is just another word for transition when it's dressed in a suit. I closed my eyes. Not to rest. To think, thank you, I said. We hung up. She was right about one thing, the maneuver wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be dramatic. The danger of control seized politely. is that it asks for consent under the banner of decency. Refusing makes you the unreasonable one. I had faced that architecture before, in litigation, in board maneuvers, in quiet asset disputes. The instructions were always the same. Make the unusual look ordinary. Make the unilateral look mutual. I placed the printed bank confirmations beside the original POA draft. Both aligned in their intent, both careful. I was not going to sign anything I didn't fully understand. More importantly, I was not going to react as though this were an isolated conversation. It wasn't. The next morning I arrived at the office early. The reception area was still empty. I walked past reception, past the conference rooms into the legal files cabinet in my inner office. I had a key, a second lock, a separate archive. Inside, I kept copies of every ownership instrument executed since incorporation, the spousal trust agreement, the holding company resolutions, the contingency provisions drafted under attorney-client privilege. They were not hidden. They were simply organized beyond the reach of casual administration. That's where the truth usually resides, not in what's concealed, but in what's properly filed. I pulled the records I needed. I cross-referenced the trust structure against the new signatory requests. The alignment became clear. She wasn't asking for operational convenience. She was preparing a transfer of control under the language of housekeeping. By lunch, I had already spoken with my independent counsel, not Marcus Thorne, the meeting she arranged. That afternoon, she summoned me to the executive conference room. The CFO sat beside her. Thorne sat across. I remained standing until invited to sit. "Harold," Evelyn began, "we're moving forward with the continuity agreement. The board has been briefed on the need for streamlined governance." She didn't ask. She informed. Across the table, Thorne slid a revised copy toward me. The operational addendum was now glowing with the gloss of inevitability. "If there are concerns," she said, her voice softening into what used to feel like warmth, "I hope we can resolve them quickly. For everyone's sake," I looked at the document. Then at her. "You've already filed a draft," I said quietly. She didn't blink. "For review." "In her capacity as COO," I continued, "not as agent with signatory authority." The room grew still. Not because I had raised my voice. Because I hadn't. Thorne shifted his papers. Evelyn's posture adjusted almost imperceptibly. "We need structure, Harold, not history." "I intend to provide both," I said. I took the document. I didn't sign it, and when I walked out, I understood something I hadn't fully accepted the night before. This wasn't paperwork. This was a claim, one she believed would be overlooked, because everyone assumes the man who built the company would simply step aside when asked politely. I have never been good at being overlooked. That evening I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not a reckless one, a quiet one, because the next move wouldn't come from defiance, it would come from evidence. The board meeting was scheduled for Monday at 9. I wasn't the one who called it. That detail mattered more than I admitted at the time. When I arrived, the conference room was already full. Not loud, just settled. Papers aligned, coffee cups placed neatly near notepads. The quiet choreography of people who had discussed something before the principal entered. Evelyn stood at the head of the table, not in my chair, but close enough to suggest proximity to it. She looked composed, confident. There's a particular posture people adopt when they believe momentum favors them. Shoulders slightly back, chin lifted just enough. "Harold," she said warmly, as though I'd just returned from vacation. "Glad you could make it. Glad you could make it." I had founded the firm. I took my seat without comment. Daniel avoided my eyes. Marcus Thorne arranged his legal pad at a deliberate angle, signaling procedural neutrality. I've seen that posture in courtrooms. It means allegiance without ownership. Evelyn began with quarterly summaries. Revenue up. Operational efficiency improved. Client onboarding streamlined. She spoke fluently, confidently, then she transitioned. "As we continue modernizing our governance structure," she said, glancing briefly at me, "we've identified the need for clearer executive continuity." There it was again. Continuity. She outlined the proposal with careful language. Delegated signatory authority. Formalized COO executive oversight. Gradual repositioning of my role into strategic advisory. not removal, repositioning. The board members nodded at intervals that felt prearranged. This ensures stability, she concluded, especially as Harold begins considering a more measured pace. Measured pace. I folded my hands on the table. I don't recall expressing that intention. A faint smile touched her lips. You've worked tirelessly for decades. We all see it. That wasn't my question. Silence stretched. One of the outside directors cleared his throat. The proposal doesn't remove you, Harold. It simply protects the organization from dependency risk. Dependency risk. The phrase settled heavier than the rest. Before I could respond, Daniel spoke, carefully. There's also the matter of consolidating voting alignment within the spousal trust, he said. Eyes still on his papers. I turned toward him slowly. Explain. He hesitated, then continued. Given that a substantial portion of shares reside within the marital trust structure, certain governance shifts can be executed internally. Internally, without my vote. I felt something cold settle just beneath my ribs. Not panic, not even anger. Recognition. You've already drafted the resolution, I said. Evelyn didn't deny it. We prepared it, she corrected gently, in case the board supports modernization. And if I don't? Her gaze held mine, steady and almost compassionate. Then we proceed in the company's best interest. It was subtle, so subtle an outsider might miss it. But what she was saying, without saying, was simple. You don't have to agree. I looked around the room. Men I had hired, directors I had mentored, professionals who once sought my counsel now studying spreadsheets to avoid my eyes. It's a peculiar sensation, to feel peripheral in the room you built. The meeting adjourned without a formal vote. Time to reflect, she called it. As chairs slid back and conversations resumed in hushed tones, I remained seated. I heard it then. Not loudly, not theatrically, just beyond the half-closed door to the adjoining office. Evelyn's voice. He won't fight it. He doesn't have the leverage people think he does. A pause. No, the shares are technically in the trust. Operational control shifts with the board resolution. Once that's signed, he's symbolic. Symbolic, I didn't move. He was brilliant once, she continued softly, almost indulgently. But without my structure? Without my intervention? He'd be nothing. There it was, not spoken to my face this time, spoken as fact. I felt something tighten, not in humiliation, but in clarity. Nothing. The word is interesting. It suggests absence, emptiness, dependency. She believed the architecture she managed was the architecture that mattered. She had mistaken surface alignment for structural authority. I stood slowly and stepped into the hallway before they noticed I had heard. Daniel emerged moments later. Startled to see me there. Harold, he said, voice lowered. This is just governance evolution. It's not personal. Everything structural is personal, I replied evenly. He swallowed. I didn't know how far it had progressed, he admitted. That's the danger of momentum, I said. It carries people further than they intend. I left the office without another word. In the parking garage, I sat in my car longer than necessary. Not because I was wounded beyond repair, but because I needed to ensure that whatever I did next came from discipline. Not pride, humiliation. Is combustible. Dignity is controlled burn, she believed I lacked leverage. She believed the trust. Structure neutralized my authority. She believed operational control equaled ownership. What she didn't, no, what none of them knew, was that long before I transferred a single share, I had structured the company through layered holding. To tease, majority interest does not always sit where it appears. Voting authority is not always where accountants assume, and the documents that governed those realities were not in the board packet. They were in a separate file, one signed years before anyone thought succession was a topic. I started the engine. By the time I reached the main road, I had already scheduled a private meeting for Wednesday morning, not with the board, with the only person in the building who understood the original architecture as well as I did. Evelyn believed I was symbolic. She believed I had no leverage. She believed I would accept the narrative of decline. She was confident. Confidence is steady until it meets documentation, and I had been preparing documentation for most of my adult life. I met with Charles Whitaker at 7:30 Wednesday. Morning. Charles had drafted the original incorporation papers 17 years earlier, back when the firm was 2 rooms above a bakery and ambition outweighed revenue. He was not flashy. No social panels, no conference appearances. He preferred precision over presence. His office still smelled faintly of old paper and cedar polish. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with binders that predated most of my current staff. When I entered, he didn't ask why I was there. "You brought the blue folder," he observed, nodding toward the leather case in my hand. I did. Then I assume the conversation at home has reached the boardroom. I allowed myself the smallest acknowledgement. It has. We sat across from one another at a narrow conference table. I removed the documents carefully. Trust agreements, holding company certificates, the layered ownership charts we had constructed long before Evelyn ever suggested operational restructuring. Charles adjusted his glasses and began reviewing them, though I knew he didn't need to. He had memorized their architecture years ago. "She's attempting to consolidate voting power through the marital trust," he asked calmly. "Yes, and she believes the trust holds majority control." "She does." He nodded once, almost to himself. "She's correct in appearance," he said. "Not in substance." That was the distinction. Years earlier, long before marriage complicates clarity, I had insisted on a 2-tier structure. The operating company visible and active, and above it, a holding entity that retained controlling membership interest through irrevocable voting shares. At the time, it was simple prudence. Protection from litigation, from external acquisition pressure, from instability. I never imagined the safeguard would one day apply internally. "The spousal trust holds economic shares," Charles continued, sliding one page toward me. "But voting control of the holding entity remains solely with you. It cannot be transferred without your explicit notarized amendment." "Which has not occurred," I said. "It has not." He folded his hands. "Operational signatory authority can shift," he went on. "Titles can change. Boards can posture. But ultimate control of the holding entity, control of the company, itself remains where it was placed 17 years ago. With me, with you." The words did not feel triumphant, they felt clarifying. "She believes I would have no leverage," I said evenly. "That without her structure I would be nothing." Charles allowed the faintest smile. "Founders who draft carefully are rarely nothing." I looked down at the signature block bearing my name from nearly 2 decades earlier. The ink had faded slightly, but the authority had not. "I don't want theatrics," I said. "No spectacle. No unnecessary damage. You want alignment restored?" "Yes," he nodded. "Then we proceed cleanly. You call a special session of the holding entity. As sole voting member, you reaffirm managerial control. The operating board answers to that structure, not the other way around. And the trust remains economic only, as designed." The simplicity of it almost disappointed me. There would be no shouting match, no dramatic legal battle. Just documentation executed precisely as written. "That's the thing about well-drafted instruments," Charles said, sensing my reflection. "They don't require emotion. They require reading." I closed the folder slowly. "Will this humiliate her?" I asked, more to myself than to him. "That depends on how loudly you choose to speak." I considered that carefully. "I don't intend to raise my voice. Then neither will the documents." Before I left, Charles handed me a slim envelope. "Certified copies," he said. "In case anyone questions authenticity." I took them. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the morning sun felt unusually sharp. Not harsh, just clear. Clarity has its own temperature. Evelyn believed operational control equaled ownership. She believed the trust structure neutralized me. She believed the board's alignment completed the transition. She had not examined the layer above. Most people don't. They stop at the surface entity because that's where titles live, where visibility lives, where ego lives. Real authority rarely introduces itself. I returned to the office just before 9. The staff moved through the lobby as usual. Phones ringing, printers humming, nothing visibly unstable. Daniel was waiting near my door. "She's scheduling the vote for Friday," he said quietly. I'm aware, I replied. He hesitated. Harold, is there anything I should know? I studied him for a moment. Fear and loyalty often look similar at a distance. Yes, I said finally. There is. I stepped into my office and placed the certified envelope on my desk. Friday won't go the way she expects. Daniel blinked. Why? Because the company does not belong to appearances, I said calmly. It belongs to its structure. I watched the realization dawn slowly across his face. She doesn't know, he murmured. No, I said. She doesn't. And for the first time since this began, I felt something steady return, not pride, not vengeance, balance. Friday would not require anger, only presentation. And when the documents were read aloud in that walnut-paneled room, the word nothing would find its proper place. Friday arrived without ceremony. The sky was overcast, the kind of flat gray that makes glass buildings look almost opaque. I arrived 10 minutes early, not to prepare. Preparation had been completed 17 years ago, but to observe. Inside the conference room, the walnut table was already lined with agenda packets. At the head sat Evelyn, not in my chair and the one directly beside it, a subtle distinction, symbolism without overreach. Good morning, she said as I entered, her tone even, professional. Good morning. The others filtered in shortly after. Daniel, 2 outside directors. Marcus Thorne, a junior associate assigned to record minutes. I placed a slim leather folder in front of me and folded my hands. Evelyn opened the meeting. As discussed, she began. Today we'll finalize the governance modernization plan. The resolution reflects consensus among executive leadership and advisory council. Consensus, she nodded toward Marcus, who distributed a final draft of the resolution. It outlined the transfer of executive authority, consolidation of signatory control, and formal repositioning of my role as non-operational chairman. The language was polished, respectful, definitive. We believe this ensures long-term stability, she concluded, glancing at me with what appeared to be compassion. Harold's legacy remains foundational. This simply reflects evolution. I waited until she finished completely. Then I spoke. Before any vote is taken, I said calmly, there's a structural matter that requires clarification. A faint crease formed between her brows. Structural? Yes. I opened the leather folder and removed a certified document. The paper was heavier than standard stock. Intentional. This, I continued, sliding copies across the table, is the operating agreement of Whitaker Holdings. Marcus looked down first. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Evelyn did not reach for the document immediately. I'm aware of our holding structure, Harold. I don't believe you are, I replied gently. Silence. Daniel picked up his copy. His eyes moved quickly across the first page, then slower as he reached the highlighted section. Marcus adjusted his glasses. This appears to be the original incorporation instrument. It is, I confirmed. Executed 17 years ago. Evelyn finally lifted the document. And? She asked evenly. And Whitaker Holdings retains 100% of the controlling membership interest in the operating company. Her expression remained composed. Yes, as marital property? No, I said, not raising my voice. As a separate entity with sole voting authority vested in its founding member. The room stilled. Marcus cleared his throat softly. The spousal trust holds economic shares, he said, scanning the text. But voting control of the holding entity is retained exclusively by Mr. Whitaker. Evelyn's eyes moved quickly now, rereading the clause. That can't be correct, she said quietly. It is, Marcus replied, slower this time. The trust benefits financially. It does not possess controlling vote over the holding entity. I folded my hands again. The board answers to the operating company. I continued. The operating company answers to Whitaker Holdings. And Whitaker Holdings has 1 voting member. No one needed to ask who that was. Evelyn looked up at me. You never transferred control, she said. I transferred economic participation, I corrected. For tax efficiency and alignment. Control remained where it began. Her composure tightened, not fractured, tightened. You let me believe I never misrepresented the structure, I said calmly. The documents were always available. Marcus leaned back slightly. Any governance resolution passed today without holding entity approval would be procedurally invalid. The words landed with professional finality. One of the outside directors shifted in his seat. So the proposed transition cannot occur, Marcus finished. Without Mr. Whitaker's affirmative vote as sole controlling member. Silence expanded across the table. Evelyn set the document down carefully. Her hands were steady. You withheld this, she said, her voice low. I drafted it, I replied. Years before succession was a topic. Her gaze sharpened. You let this proceed. I allowed discussion, I said. I did not consent to displacement. Daniel exhaled slowly. Almost imperceptibly. The junior associate stopped typing. For a moment, no one spoke. Then I did. I have no objection to modernization, I said evenly. Operational efficiency is welcome. Advisory expansion is welcome. But authority is not reassigned through assumption. I slid a second document forward. This is a reaffirmation of managerial control executed this morning under the holding entity. It clarifies governance alignment and preserves current leadership structure. Marcus reviewed it quickly and nodded once. It is valid. Evelyn looked at the paper but did not touch it. You blindsided me, she said. I considered that. No, I replied softly. I read the documents. The difference hung in the air. One of the directors spoke cautiously. Given this clarification, I recommend we table the modernization vote. Marcus nodded. Procedurally sound. Evelyn remained very still. She had not shouted. She had not pleaded. She simply recalculated. You could have told me, she said quietly. I assumed you had examined the structure. I answered. That was the closest I came to reproach. No one looked at me with avoidance now. They looked directly. Not because I had raised my voice, because the architecture had spoken. Evelyn gathered her papers, slowly. So nothing changes, she said. Tone neutral. Structure remains as designed, I replied. Performance discussions can continue. There was no gavel, no dramatic exit, just a quiet adjournment. As chairs shifted and the room began to empty, I remained seated. Evelyn paused beside me. For the first time since this began, there was no strategic softness in her expression, only recognition. You're not nothing, she said. It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission. I closed the folder gently. I never was, I said. Power rarely announces itself when it returns. It simply resumes its proper posture. The days following the meeting were uneventful on the surface. No emergency memos, no public explanations. The board minutes reflected a structural clarification and a unanimous decision to defer governance adjustments. Pending further review, language can soften almost anything. Evelyn did not come to my office that afternoon, nor the next morning. Instead, she sent a brief email. We need to discuss alignment privately. I replied with a single sentence. My door is open at 4. She arrived precisely on time. No entourage. No folders. She closed the door behind her and remained standing for a moment before taking the chair opposite my desk. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. You never mentioned the holding entity retained sole voting control, she said at last. It was in every annual disclosure, I replied evenly. Attached to each board summary. You knew I believed the trust consolidated authority. I knew you hadn't asked. That landed. She folded her hands, mirroring a posture I'd held many times before. I wasn't trying to erase you, she said. I was trying to protect momentum. By removing the architect? By streamlining execution. I considered her carefully. Execution without authority creates fracture, I said. You attempted to solve a hypothetical risk by creating a real one. She didn't argue. For the first time in weeks, her voice lost its managerial polish. I thought you were slowing down, she admitted. You were less visible, less aggressive. I was observant. I corrected gently. Her gaze shifted. You let me build a narrative. I let you speak. Silence again. There's a moment in any power shift when the losing side expects retaliation. A tightening. A demand for apology. A visible assertion of dominance. I offered none. Instead, I opened a slim file on my desk. "I'm restructuring executive oversight," I said calmly. "Not to diminish you, to clarify boundaries." She looked up. "Operational efficiency remains under your supervision," I continued. "But all governance proposals move through holding review before board circulation. No external counsel engaged without joint approval. Financial reporting delivered unfiltered to both of us." She absorbed it quietly. "And if I decline?" she asked, echoing my earlier question from weeks before. "Then we reassess roles formally," I replied, without assumption. The steadiness in my tone was not threat, it was policy. She exhaled slowly. "You're not interested in humiliating me," she said almost cautiously. "No." "Why?" "Because humiliation corrodes the structure it claims to defend." Aloud, I said, "Because authority doesn't require spectacle." Her shoulders lowered slightly. "Not in defeat. In recalibration." "I miscalculated," she said finally. "Yes," I agreed. The word was not sharp, it was accurate. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "When I said you'd be nothing without me," she began. "You believed it," I said. Her silence confirmed it. "I built systems," she said. "Visibility, relationships. And I built foundation," I replied. For the first time, we were describing reality instead of defending it. She nodded once and left. In the weeks that followed, the office atmosphere shifted subtly. Not because anyone announced the outcome, but because posture changed. Daniel's reports arrived simultaneously to both of us. Board members addressed strategic questions directly to me again. External counsel requests were routed properly, nothing dramatic, just alignment. Restored. Evelyn remained COO, competent, focused, quieter. In meetings, and I remained where I had always been, not louder, simply present. Authority, when tested and reaffirmed, does not expand. It settles. One afternoon, I passed the Walnut conference room and paused at the doorway. The table looked the same as it had on Friday, but the energy was different. No one avoided my eyes anymore. No one spoke for me. No one spoke over me. There had been no shouting, no courtroom battle, no public unraveling, just documents read aloud, and the quiet understanding that structure outweighs assumption. That evening at home, Evelyn and I sat across from each other at the same dining table where the power of attorney draft had first appeared. Neither of us mentioned it. Some lessons do not require repetition. She reached for her glass of water. "You were prepared long before I was," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "For me?" "No," I said. "For uncertainty." She nodded slowly. The distinction mattered, because this was never about proving I was indispensable. It was about understanding. The dignity does not disappear simply because someone declares it absent, and leverage does not evaporate because someone assumes it does. The documents had done their duty. Now it was time to decide what the experience meant. People often ask, when they finally hear a story like this, whether I felt vindicated. The honest answer is, well, vindication implies celebration. And there was nothing to celebrate in watching someone I once trusted realize she had misjudged not only my leverage, but my character. What I felt instead was quieter, something closer to sorrow wearing the clothing of calm. The company continued. Contracts renewed. Employees kept their positions. Nothing collapsed. That was in many ways the point. The structure I had built years earlier did exactly what good structure is supposed to do. It absorbed the shock without breaking. But structure protects institutions. It doesn't protect the heart. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn and I settled into a careful coexistence. Professional, courteous, efficient. We discussed governance, quarterly targets, personnel decisions. We did not discuss the dining table, or the phone call I overheard, or the word she used so easily. Nothing. I thought about that word often, not because it wounded me anymore, but because of what it revealed, not about me, but about how she had come to define worth. She measured value in visibility, in motion, in the noise a person makes while operating. I have always believed differently. The most important work I ever did was rarely seen. Contracts reviewed at 5 a.m. Contingencies drafted for scenarios that might never occur. Quiet safeguards built not from suspicion, but from responsibility. None of it photographed well. None of it fit on a conference panel. But when the moment came, it held. That is the nature of foundation. It is invisible until everything above it depends on it. I want to be clear about something, because it matters. I did not structure the company as a trap. I did not anticipate betrayal from within my own marriage. When I placed voting control in the holding entity 17 years earlier, I was thinking about lawsuits, market downturns, hostile acquisition, external threats. I was not preparing for Evelyn, I was preparing for uncertainty. There is a difference between distrust and discipline. Distrust assumes the worst of a specific person. Discipline assumes nothing and prepares anyway. Had I built those safeguards out of suspicion toward my wife, that would have been its own kind of betrayal. But I hadn't. I had simply refused to leave the foundation of everything I built resting on assumption. And assumption, in the end, was what unraveled her. Plan. She assumed operational control equaled ownership. She assumed visibility equaled authority. She assumed silence equaled surrender. She assumed that a man who does not raise his voice has nothing left to say. Each assumption was reasonable. Each was wrong. I don't tell this story to diminish her. She was intelligent, capable, and genuinely skilled at the things she did well. The company benefited from her presence. That was never in question. What was in question was whether contribution grants entitlement, whether helping build something gives you the right to redefine who built it, whether presence can quietly rewrite history. It cannot. Not because history is sacred, but because truth, properly documented, does not bend to narrative. In the months that followed, our marriage did not recover in the way marriages do in sentimental stories. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tearful embrace. What there was instead was honesty. Perhaps for the first time in years. One evening she asked me directly, "Do you still trust me?" I considered the question carefully because she deserved a truthful answer. "I trust your competence," I said. "I'm still learning whether I can trust your intentions." She didn't flinch. "That's fair," she replied. And it was. Trust, once fractured, does not return simply because circumstances stabilize. It is rebuilt slowly through consistency, or it is not rebuilt at all. We chose to attempt the former, not out of romance, but out of respect for what we had spent decades constructing together. Whether it fully returns, I cannot yet say. Some things heal, some things merely scar over and continue functioning. I've made peace with not knowing which this will be. What I have learned, at 66 years of age, is this: dignity is not something others grant you. It is not conferred by titles or applause or the temporary agreement of a room. Dignity is something you carry quietly and either honor or abandon by your own conduct. When Evelyn told me I would be nothing without her, she believed she was stating a fact, but worth was never something she could revoke, because it was never something she gave me. I built it, slowly, invisibly, over decades, not for recognition, but because building was who I was. The company was simply one expression of that. Take the company away and the man who built it still remains. Diminish his title, and the discipline that earned it stays intact. Strip away the visibility, and the foundation is still there. Holding. That is what she failed to understand. You cannot make a man nothing by declaring him so. You can only reveal what he was made of when he chooses not to shout back. I think often about that boardroom now. About how quiet it became when the documents were read aloud. About how the shift in the room required no anger, no theatrics, no cruelty. Just truth calmly presented. There is a temptation in moments like that to punish. To humiliate the person who tried to diminish you. To make them feel the smallness they attempted to impose. I understood that temptation. I chose not to indulge it. Not because Evelyn deserved protection, but because I did. Because who I become in victory matters more than the victory itself. A man reveals his character, not in how he handles disrespect, but in how he handles power once it returns to his hands. I could have removed her, publicly, completely. I didn't. Not out of weakness, out of restraint. And restraint, I have come to believe, is the truest form of strength available to a man in his later years. Anyone can react. Anyone can retaliate. It takes discipline to hold power steadily and use only as much of it as the situation requires. The documents restored my authority. But my conduct afterward restored something more important: my peace. These days, I still arrive before the others, still drink black coffee, still review the important contracts by hand. The bakery beneath our first office closed years ago, but I kept the pen from that first lease. It sits on my desk, unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know its history. Sometimes I hold it while I think. It reminds me that everything begins small, and that the foundations laid in obscurity are the ones that determine whether you survive the storms no one sees coming. Evelyn and I still share a home, and a company, and a complicated, recalibrated respect. Whether it becomes love again, I do not know, but I no longer need her approval to know my worth. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson beneath all of this, the one I would offer to any man who has ever been told, softly or cruelly, that he is nothing without someone else. Let them believe it. If they must, then build your life so carefully, so honestly, and so well, that when the moment comes, the truth speaks for you. You will not need to raise your voice. You will only need to open the folder and let the documents remind them of what was always there.